Forge gang! I am still a hard man. Let's go. All right, so this is not part of life in historical ages. This is not going to be part of the series I've been doing on life in historical ages. This is going to be something entirely to itself. It's going to be a complete history of Ireland. I have been wanting to do this for quite some time. And so let's just dive right into it. All right, sharing screen. Interdimensional Lizard says, top of the morning to ya. Top of the morning. Good morning. Good morning. How are you doing? In my part of the world, it's evening, though. It's not morning. But yes, I have been wanting to do this for some time. And now I'm going to do it. Oh, yes. This is going to be the history of Ireland. And what a fun, joyful ride this will be. It's not going to be too long. But anyways, Ireland's early inhabitants, Stone Age people. The first people arrived in Ireland about 9,000 years ago, around 7,000 BC. We now call them Stone Age people because they use stone tools for their farm work and for hunting. We know about these early settlers in Ireland because many of their tools and weapons survived and have been found by archaeologists. This is a Stone Age hunter. These first settlers in Ireland made weapons and tools out of stone. These first settlers in Ireland made weapons and tools out of a sharp stone called flint, especially axe heads. At first, they lived mainly along the coast of Ireland or near rivers because they were hunters. They mainly ate berries, fruit, and wild animals and moved from place to place. From about 3,500 BC, the Stone Age people began to clear away forests to make farmland. The Stone Age went on for a very long time, and many changes took place. We therefore call the Stone Age people by different names, depending on when they lived during this long period of time. The people who lived at the beginning of this time were known as the early Stone Age people, Paleolithic. Those in the middle of the period, the Mesolithic, were known as the Middle Stone Age people or Mesolithic people. The people at the end of this period became known as the New Stone Age or Neolithic people. The later Stone Age people or Neolithic people in Ireland were farmers. This later Stone Age period is from about 4,000 to 2,000 BC, which means that the first farmers lived in Ireland about 6,000 years ago. These farmers were able to cultivate land and raise cattle, cooking together courtesy of Stephanie Rowe. Or Stephanie Rowe. Okay, so there's some threads on the Bronze Age. Let's see here. Bronze Age people. From about 2000 to 1800 BC, A people skilled in metalwork came to live in Ireland. They made bronze tools and weapons. To do this, they mixed copper from Ireland with tin from Spain. Bronze was easier to shape than stone, and it did not break as easily. Bronze Age people built circles made of standing stones called stone circles. The stone circles were used in ceremonies. Bronze Age farm courtesy of Stephanie Roa. How did Bronze Age people cook? Besides some of the stone circles, archaeologists have found cooking sites called Fulachfia. At the Fulachfia, the people filled up a small hole with water and boiled the water using large hot stones from a nearby fire. Meat was wrapped in straw to keep it clean as it boiled in the water. Iron Age people, Celts. We call the Iron Age the time when people began to use iron tools and weapons. This began in about 500 BC. Iron tools were much stronger than bronze. The people who first used iron tools are known as the Celts. 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 The Celts were a group of people from the mainland of Europe. It is not exactly clear when the Celts first came to Ireland, as they did not leave written records. However, many historians think they came sometime about 300 BC. They settled all around the part of the world that we now call Europe. From about 450 BC to 250 BC, the Celts were the most powerful group in the area of Europe. The Celts had their own language and customs. The earlier peoples in Ireland during this period copied some of these Celtic language and customs. Warriors. The Celts were fierce warriors, and they often fought against other powerful groups such as the Romans. They brought many changes to Ireland, as they knew how to make both weapons and tools from iron. Iron weapons were much stronger than bronze weapons, and so the Celts could defeat other peoples they encountered in Ireland. Despite the many changes the Celts made, they left the existing ancient stone monuments in place. As iron was introduced to Ireland at this time, we call this period the Iron Age. I can't believe that they don't even mention Newgrange. They don't even talk about the Newgrange or nothing. Celts in Ireland. How do we know about the Celts in Ireland? Archaeologists dig underground to find evidence of how people lived long ago. Ireland has lots of old ruins and mounds of earth which hide ancient artifacts. They are found in the landscape and tell us a lot of information about people like the Celts. For example, many pins, brooches, and items of jewelry have been found, which show us not only how the Celts fastened their clothing, but also that they were skilled at making beautiful designs on metal. Wealthy Celts wore gold bracelets as well as collars known as torques. The liene, was a long tunic worn by a Celtic nobleman. A belt called a krios was usually tied across the tunic, and a woolen cloak called a brat was often worn over it. Celtic homes. The Celts built large earthen banks of stone walls around their farms to protect themselves and their animals. These walls were called rafts or dunes. The more important families had several circular banks protecting their homes, and sometimes they built their homes on high ground, which were called hill forts. Some families built forts surrounded by stone walls or banks of earth on headlands looking out to sea. The Celts loved storytelling. Before they learned to write, the Celts passed on their stories from one generation to another. The people of Celtic times also believed in a race of little people called the Tuatha Dé Danann. These little people were believed to live in the other world, which was thought to be under the hills. Religion. The Celts worshipped a number of gods. For example, the god Lugh, or Lugh Lamhafata, was their god of skillful fighting, poetry, and music. And Lughnasadh, which is the Irish word for August, is named after the god Lugh. The Celts also had gods of the harvest and gods of the earth and land. In their pagan religion before Christianity, the Celts also worshipped goddesses such as Danu and Anu. The goddess Anu was believed to be the goddess of prosperity and the mother of the other gods. Celtic house, courtesy of Stephanie Rowe. Celtic settlement. Early Christian Ireland. Early Christian Ireland is the period from about 400 to 1000 AD. Christianity first came to Ireland in the 5th century, around 431 AD. Most people in Ireland at that time believed in pagan gods. Only a few pieces of evidence survive from this period, so it is not clear who the first Christians in Ireland were. Some historians believe that the first Christians in Ireland were slaves captured in England and taken to Ireland. St. Patrick. St. Patrick was once a slave in Ireland, and from the age of 16 he worked as a shepherd for 6 years. He later became one of the early bishops in Ireland who taught people about Christ. He wrote a book called The Confession, and in it he tells about his life in Ireland. Eosin meets with St. Patrick. It is believed that St. Patrick arrived in Ireland in 432 AD. At that time, most of the people believed in pagan gods. However, many people in Ireland soon changed to Christianity when they heard the gospel that Patrick and others told them. During the time of St. Patrick, Ireland did not have towns or cities. However, little settlements grew up around monasteries and their churches. Monasteries. From about 500 AD, monasteries were built in Ireland. The first monasteries were usually built in isolated places like Glendalough in County Wicklow, or on islands such as Skellig Michael off the coast of County Kerry. Some monasteries were also built near the forts of important kings, like the monastery of Clonard in County Meath. The monks chose these isolated places because it allowed them to pray and work without distraction. In these early monasteries, monks lived in small bedrooms called cells. One of the first monks was St. Enda, who set up a monastery in the Aran Islands. St. Brigid also founded a number of monasteries. Skellig Michael, courtesy of Notes on Irish Architecture, 1875. Irish monasteries became famous for their learning, and many students came to study in them from other parts of Europe. Irish monks also spread Christianity across Europe. Books and manuscripts. As well as praying and fasting, some monks spent their lives making beautiful copies of the Bible. The Book of Kells, written in the 9th century, about 800 AD. A famous example of this. It was named after a town called Kells in County Meath, where it was once kept. This book can now be seen in Trinity College, Dublin. Another famous book which was written by monks in Ireland is the Book of Durrow. The monks often put valuable covers on their books and manuscripts. Book covers were often made of metal and decorated with valuables such as jewels. The monks also paid silversmiths to make gold and silver chalices. An example of these chalices is the Ardagh chalice, which you can see in the National Museum of Dublin. The Ardagh chalice was made in the 8th century AD. Book of Kells, Fold 29R, Board of Trinity College, Dublin. The Voyage of Brendan the Navigator. Irish monks often traveled to other countries to spread the gospel. In 563 AD, a famous Irish monk called St. Columba traveled to Scotland to teach the people about Christ. He founded a monastery on the island of Iona in the Hebrides in Scotland. In the Hebrides in Scotland. Another monk, St. Brendan, or Brendan the Abbot, was also a traveling monk. He is thought to have been born in 489 near Killarney in County Kerry. He lived until approximately 570 or 580 AD. St. Brendan founded many monasteries such as Ardfert Cathedral in County Kerry and Clonfert in County Galway. St. Brendan the Navigator, courtesy of a post. Sea voyages. Records show that St. Brendan undertook many sea voyages around Ireland, Wales, and western Scotland before he undertook his famous journey to the New World in America, allegedly. A story written in Latin describes this journey. The story tells that Brendan and the other monks saw a volcanic eruption. The story also describes how they saw crystal floating in the sea, and that they were chased by a sea monster. Some people doubted that a boat made of ox hides could have made such a long journey. However, a sailor and geographer named Tim Severin recreated the 6th century voyage of St. Brendan in 1976 and 1977. High crosses. There are many beautiful stone crosses in Ireland today. Some of the stone crosses are made of sandstone and have been taken into museums to protect them from the weather. These crosses are sometimes called Celtic crosses, as they have Celtic patterns and circles on top of a Christian cross. High cross at Monasterbos. Many crosses have lovely scenes from the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. These crosses are known as high crosses. The drawings on them helped the monks teach people about the gospel. The drawings were useful as the people could not read, but they could understand the pictures. As well as scenes from the Bible, the sculptures on the crosses sometimes contained a message. For example, pictures of St. John the Baptist were used on the crosses to give the message that it was important to be baptized. Many high crosses were made in the 9th century, 800 to 899. These crosses from the 9th century have more biblical scenes on them than crosses from other periods, particularly the 12th century. High Cross of Monasterboice, Thule High Cross. Round towers. There are a number of round towers in Ireland, such as the one at Clonmacnoise in County Offaly. The monasteries kept their valuables in these round towers to protect them from being stolen by local chieftains. The Vikings were also a threat to the monks in monasteries as they stole many of their valuables. Church and Round Tower at Clonmacnoise. Ordinary people in early Christian Ireland. From 400 AD, Ordinary farming people lived in circular enclosures in farming groups. These were known as rath or fort and were surrounded by mounds. Irish National Heritage Park image courtesy of Irish National Heritage Park. Stioga Fort. The Vikings in Ireland, 795 AD onward. During early Christian Ireland, many of the monasteries were often attacked by different groups. The Irish sometimes raided monasteries looking for treasures. However, the problem worsened for the monasteries in the 8th century when the Vikings or Norsemen from Scandinavia began to raid Ireland. They were feared by everyone because they killed anyone who got in their way or took them as slaves. In 795, Viking longships began to raid various places in Ireland. At first, they attacked the monasteries along the coast, and later they raided inland. The Vikings were great experts at building boats, which were used for long journeys. Some of their longships have been found underwater in places like Roskilde in Denmark. We know that the Vikings stole treasures from Ireland because many of them were later found. For example, one of these treasures, Ranvag's casket, was given on loan to the National Museum of Ireland. It is usually in the National Museum of Denmark. The Vikings who came to Ireland from 795 to 840 were mainly from an area now known as Norway. The Danish Vikings came to Ireland from about 849 and fought the Norse Vikings. Viking on Luaf Ree, a Viking longboat. Viking traders and craftsmen. The Vikings were traders and were also skilled blacksmiths and metal workers. Many settled in places like Russia, Iceland, and Greenland. Many Vikings also settled in Ireland and set up towns along the coast, such as Dublin, which they started building in 841, and also Wexford, Cork, Limerick, etc. These new towns meant that trade between Ireland and Europe developed. Many of the Vikings married Irish people, and they became known as the Irish Norse. However, the Vikings and the people who already lived in Ireland did not always agree and continued to fight each other. Sometimes some Irish kings joined with a Viking leader to attack another Irish chief or king. Warfare was therefore common at this time. A great battle known as the Battle of Clontarf took place in 1014, just outside Dublin. At Clontarf, the strongest king in Ireland, the Irish High King Brian Boru, fought and defeated a Viking army. After this battle, peace began to develop between the Vikings and Celtic peoples, and they gradually adopted each other's ideas and customs. Sculpture of King Brian Boru, Chapel Royal, Dublin Castle. We know about the Vikings because they buried things like jewelry, tools, weapons, and household goods in their graves. Sometimes entire ships were buried with important people. The Vikings also settled in parts of England and a region of France now called Normandy. Norman Ireland, otherwise known as Medieval Ireland. This is the time period in which the English began their gradual colonization of the island. Norman Ireland, Medieval Ireland. In the 12th century, the 1100s, there were many warring clans in Ireland. Each clan had their own king. The most powerful king was known as the High King. For example, Turlough O'Connor, who died in 1156, was once the High King of Ireland, just like Brian Boru. In order to become High King, a king had to fight against other powerful kings. Sometimes the king of Connacht would win. Other times it might be the king of Leinster, Munster, or Ulster. These constant fights meant that kings had many enemies. The reason the Normans first came to Ireland was in fact due to this fighting. In 1169, a group of Norman soldiers and knights arrived in Wexford to help the Irish king of Leinster, Diarmuid MacMairith. MacMairith. They were invited by Diarmuid to help him fight his enemies and regain his kingdom in Leinster. Diarmuid MacMairith particularly wanted to defeat Turnan O'Rourke, the ruler of Breffni, now Roscommon, and Rory O'Connor, the king of Connacht, because they had joined armies and it forced Diarmuid out of his kingdom. Diarmuid MacMairith knew that there were Norman knights and soldiers in England, and he invited them to Ireland to help him. The first had to get permission from King Henry II, who at the time was the King of England and also the King of Normandy in France. In 1170, a Norman lord called Richard de Clare, nicknamed Strongbow, came to Ireland from Wales. Strongbow brought archers, knights, and horsemen with him and helped Diarmuid to capture Waterford and Dublin. Strongbow later married Diarmuid's daughter, Eofa. In 1171, when Diarmuid died, Strongbow became the king of Leinster. This meant that by 1170 the Normans had taken over much of the east of Ireland. By the 1300s, the Normans had castles and power in many parts of Ireland. Dermot MacMairith, courtesy of Wicklow County Libraries. Strongbow, courtesy of Wicklow County Libraries. Norman power in Ireland. How did the Normans become powerful in Ireland? King Henry II, the Norman King of England and also part of France, came to Ireland in 1171. He allowed Strongbow to keep the rule of Leinster, and he gave Meath to another lord called Hugh de Lacy. Many of the important Irish leaders were afraid that they might be attacked by the Normans, so they made friends with King Henry II and agreed that he would be their overlord and protector in return for certain deals and promises. King Henry left Ireland in 1172, but called himself the Supreme Lord of Ireland. Leixlip Castle, the keep of Carrickfergus Castle, County Antrim. The Norman lords soon took over some of the lands belonging to Irish clans. They were able to keep control because they had good weapons such as crossbows and were well protected by the armor they wore in battle and also by their castles. They built their castles on high ground. The castles were initially made of timber and later made of stone. These strong castles made it difficult for Irish clans to attack the Normans. The Normans mainly had control on the east of Ireland. They never conquered the whole country. Norman building One of the most important Norman castles was in Trim, County Meath, where Hugues de Lacy lived. Trim Castle was the main castle of the Normans in Ireland. Some other Norman lords were also very powerful and built other large castles, such as Carrickfergus Castle, which was owned by John de Courcy. John de Courcy. The Normans invited poorer people from England and Wales to come to Ireland and live on their lands. They wanted these workers to grow crops and pay them rent. Trim Castle, County Meath, by permission of Meath County Library. The Keep of Trim Castle, County Meath. The Normans were Christians and built many cathedrals. The cathedrals were usually built in places where there was already a monastery. However, the Normans also established their own new monasteries. These were much larger than the earlier Irish monasteries. The Normans also tried to build towns such as Carlow, Carrickfergus, and Drogheda. They built walls around the towns to prevent attack. These walls had gates that could be closed. They also had towers for lookouts. Norman names. Other Norman families soon arrived in Ireland, and many new names were introduced. For example, Fitzgerald, Fitzmaurice, Power, and Prendergast. These Norman surnames seem strange to Irish people at the time, as most Irish names began with O, which meant from the family of, and Mac, which meant son of. And then a phenomenon happened that usually always happens to people that come to Ireland. They slowly become Irish. Normans becoming more Irish. The 14th century in Ireland, the Normans become more Gaelic or Irish. Many Normans began to speak Irish, to marry Irish people, and to take on Irish customs. In 1366, Normans in Ireland were forbidden by their king in England to speak in Irish, to dress like the Irish, or to adopt Irish customs. These laws became known as the Statutes of Kilkenny. However, they failed to stop Normans from adopting Irish traditions or from marrying into Irish families. Statutes of Kilkenny, courtesy of Troops Out movement. Some powerful Norman Irish families grew up in Ireland, such as the Fitzgeralds of Kildare and the Geraldines of Munster. The titles of the most powerful Norman lords included the Earl of Desmond, the Munster Norman lord, the Earl of Ormond, and Earl of Kildare, James, 9th Earl of Ormond, Seamus Becacca. Kilkenny County Library stock, Normans and inheritance. The Normans used English law when it came to inheritance. This meant that the eldest son always was next in line to take over from his father, the Norman lord. Under Irish or Breton law, the clan had to agree on the next leader. This meant that there were often quarrels within families. These quarrels were sometimes worsened by the fact that the English government would have supported the oldest son, while the clan might have supported a younger son to become leader. Then there is really when things get bad. Things get really bad because in the 16th century, there is a lot of complicated stuff that happens. So Ireland in the age of the Tudors. In the 16th century, many parts of Ireland were controlled by different Gaelic chiefs and their families known as clans. In parts of Munster and Leinster, including an area stretching north and south of Dublin known as the Pale, There were many groups who were loyal to the King of England and who followed English laws and customs. The Gaelic or Irish parts of these regions had their own laws, customs, and language. Loyalty to King Henry VIII. In 1541, the King of England, Henry VIII, from a family called the Tudors, took the title King of Ireland. Some of the Gaelic chiefs, including Con O'Neill, gained titles from King Henry in exchange for promising loyalty to him. In exchange for their loyalty and obeying to keep English laws, King Henry promised them that their direct family line would remain in power. By the time Henry died in 1547, about 40 Gaelic lords had promised their loyalty to him and had been given English titles. Two of these clans were O'Neill and O'Donnell of Ulster, both of whom had become earls. In times of peace, this arrangement worked. However, if the Gaelic lords rebelled against the king, all their lands were confiscated according to English law. The reason the Gaelic chieftains sometimes rebelled was due to the greater demands the Tudor monarchs made on them. Many Gaelic chieftains strongly resisted Henry and the other Tudor monarchs. Some chieftains also attacked people who were loyal to Henry. Many clans who were loyal to the English monarch lived in the Pale. The Pale was an area around Dublin, including parts of Kildare, Meath, and Louth, which was under the direct control of the English government. English settlers to Ireland. Two of Henry VIII's children, Queen Mary and her half-sister Queen Elizabeth, decided that the English monarch needed to have more power in Ireland. One way of doing this involved sending more loyal subjects to Ireland and giving them confiscated lands. These lands became known as plantation land, as the people were known as having been planted on it. Queen Mary ruled from 1553 and 1558, and Queen Elizabeth ruled between 1558 and 1603. And this is where the problem begins to exacerbate a lot, is the plantation system in Ireland by Protestants. Tudor plantations. In 1556 and 1557, Queen Mary Tudor took the lands of the Gaelic clans, the O'Moores and O'Connors, and gave these lands to loyal English settlers. The arrival of these new settlers to Ireland, however, created a lot of unrest, as the Irish clans wanted their land back and often attacked the new settlers. The settling of English people on native Irish land was called a plantation. The new English people who arrived were called settlers or planters. The settlers got 2/3 of the land, and some Irish were moved to poorer quality lands near the Shannon. Settlers had to promise to build stone houses and to have weapons in case they were attacked by Gaelic clans. They were not allowed to mix with Irish families or to marry them. They were forbidden even to have them as servants or to rent land to them. This was because the Queen only wanted English-speaking loyal subjects living in the plantation areas. Any Irish who lived in the western part of the planted land had to promise to obey English laws. The Queen ordered that the confiscated lands of O'Moores, and O'Connors should be divided into 2 counties. The area called the Lowys by the Irish was given the new name of Queen's County, and its main town was called Mary Bereth. Today it is called Partouase, Port Port Liwase, Port Liosi. Offaly was called King's County, after Mary's husband, King Philip II, and its main town was called Philipstown. Today it is called Diangian. Interesting that these plantations were started by a Catholic monarch. Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth was Queen of England from 1558 to 1603. She wanted to have firm control of Ireland because she feared that her enemy, the Spanish and Catholic king, King Philip II, would send forces to Ireland and would use them to attack England. She wanted Ireland to be loyal to England. To do this, she sent more English settlers to Ireland and gave them lands cheaply so that they would keep the neighboring Gaelic clans and chiefs under control. Elizabeth also established a new religion from the Protestant faith. It was called the Anglican faith. Rebellion in 1580. You could probably say that this is the first Irish War of Independence against British tyranny. Rebellion in 1580. Munster was ruled at the time by a powerful family led by the Earl of Desmond, who at first was on friendly terms with the Queen. However, in 1580, a rebellion began in Munster against Queen Elizabeth. Many of the families who lived there, such as the Fitzmaurices, hoped to get help from the Catholic King of Spain to defeat Queen Elizabeth. The Earl of Desmond did not put down the rebellion and was called a traitor by the agents of the Queen. His estate lands were burned and his tenants were killed. The Earl's castles were also taken. In 1580, the Queen's new deputy, Lord Grey, led an English fleet of ships into the Bay of Smerwick, Dun an Ayr in Irish, and laid siege to the fort, which was being defended by 600 Irish and Spanish soldiers. After 3 days, the soldiers and the rebels surrendered. A monument was erected in 1980 to commemorate the massacre of the whole garrison, which had surrendered at the fort of the Fitzmaurices in Smerwick County, Kerry. In order to force other rebels to surrender during the 1580s, the English troops under Lord Grey destroyed the lands of the rebels in 5 counties. This caused a famine to occur in Munster. The Earl of Desmond was hunted down and killed in 1583. Huge areas of land in Munster were taken over by the English crown. From 1585, the plantation of Munster began, and new English settlers were given land. Many of the new settlers found it difficult to find the location of their new land, and the local Irish population was hostile to them. About 300,000 acres of land were confiscated in total. Some huge estates were given to Englishmen, such as Walter Raleigh. These new settlements were often attacked by the local population, and many settlers decided to return to England. Ireland in the 17th century. Ulster Plantation. 2 strong chiefs from the O'Neill and O'Donnell clans resisted the English armies, that were sent from England to control Ulster. From 1594 to 1603, Ulster chiefs and their followers began a war against Queen Elizabeth. This war became known as the 9 Years' War. The chiefs won many battles during the war, and Hoof O'Neill hoped to get further help from Elizabeth's rival, Philip of Spain. In 1598, Hoof O'Neill defeated the English army at a famous battle called the Battle of the Yellow Ford. This rebellion in Ulster spread to Munster. Elizabeth was worried about the danger of Spanish armies coming to Ireland to fight against England. Gaelic chiefs had made many appeals to the Catholic King Philip of Spain for help in driving the English out of Ireland. Spanish help finally arrived in the autumn of 1601. However, the ships of the Spanish soldiers arrived in Kinsale, County Cork, instead of in Ulster. This forced the northern Gaelic chiefs to march all the way from Ulster to Cork to join the Spanish army. In 1601, the Spanish and Irish forces were defeated at Kinsale by Lord Mountjoy, the Lord Deputy in Ireland. Hoof O'Neill, the most powerful Gaelic chief, signed a treaty at Millafont in 1603, which brought an end to the 9 Years' War. The treaty was called the Treaty of Millafont. The Ulster chiefs had to promise to live according to English rather than Irish law. They were told that if they did this, they could keep their lands. Queen Elizabeth was now dead, and a new ruling family called the Stuarts took power in England. Steel sculpture of Red Hoof O'Connell, Maris Heron. Route of Red Hoof O'Donnell's march to Kinsale, 1601. Mulroy College, Milford, County Donegal, and Milford Community Library. Hoof O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. Flight of the Earls. In 1607, Hoof O'Neill, a great Gaelic chief, left Ireland for Europe, along with many other powerful Irish chiefs like Rory O'Donnell. This became known as the Flight of the Earls. They hoped to get help from the King of Spain, but the Earls never returned to Ireland. After the Earls left, English laws and language took hold in Ulster. In 1609, the Ulster plantation began on the orders of King James I. 1609, plantation of Ulster. English crown decided that the only way to keep control of Ireland would be to plant the confiscated lands with English farmers and landlords. The plantation of Ulster took place between 1609 and 1690, when the lands of the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, and any of their friends were taken and granted to Scottish and English settlers. Some lands were kept for building towns. There were very few towns in Ulster before the plantation. By 1611, the development of new towns such as Bangor and Belfast had begun. Some towns were built around the forts which the English had built, such as Derry, Enniskillen, and Omagh. New settlers arrived in Ulster. They were English and Scottish. Many Presbyterians came from Scotland. The new settlers did not employ the poets and musicians which the Gaelic chiefs had employed. However, some of them set up private schools known as hedge schools. The Irish language began to decline after the earls departed in 1607, and English language became the language of power. The Ulster Plantation counties, courtesy of the Ulster Scots Agency. Rebellion and Cromwellian Wars. Rebellion and Cromwellian Wars. The ruler of England was also the ruler of Ireland for most of the 16th century, which meant that when decisions were made in England, similar decisions were made for Ireland too. In the 1600s, the King of England was King Charles I. However, England had its own parliament. The parliament and the king often quarreled over money that the king wanted for wars and other expenses. In 1642, a civil war started in England. People who supported the king were called the Royalists. Those who supported the Parliament were called the Parliamentarians. The Parliamentarians were led by a man called Oliver Cromwell. People in Ireland began to take sides too. Many people in Ireland were in favor of the king, and many battles were fought against the Parliament forces. End of the Civil War. In 1649, the English Civil War ended. The king was executed in 1649, and Cromwell took over as the Lord Protector. He decided to punish all those who had supported the king. He came to Ireland in 1649 with a large army and laid siege to Drogheda. The town fell and the people were put to death. Cromwell also attacked Wexford. The cruel treatment which Cromwell gave to those who surrendered meant that people in Ireland lived in fear of him and his army. Gradually, all Irish towns submitted to Cromwell. Galway was the last town to surrender to the forces of Cromwell in 1652. A lot of land was burned and food supplies were destroyed in order to prevent the parliamentarians from being attacked. This caused famine in Ireland. Large numbers of civilians and armies on both sides also died of plague. Oliver Cromwell, or this is a picture of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwellian settlement. After Cromwell's victory, huge areas of land were confiscated and the Irish were banished to the lands of Connacht. Most of the lands of Clara, Galway, and Mayo were taken over by Irish people whose lands in other parts of the country had been taken from them. This movement of large numbers of people cut off their lands, and the transfer of these lands to English people was known as the Cromwellian settlement, the Cromwellian settlement. Many other Irish people were transported to work on plantations in the West Indies. Irish soldiers were given the opportunity to exile. Large numbers of Irish men left to become soldiers in other armies in Europe and never returned. Good lands were given to Cromwell's soldiers and to the supporters of the parliamentarians. Other lands were bought by English merchants, and some of these new owners took on Catholic tenants. Oliver Cromwell, University of Texas Library. Battle of the Boyne, 1690. The War of the Two Kings. In 1685, King James II, a Catholic, became the King of England following the death of his brother Charles II. The English wanted a Protestant king and were determined to get rid of King James II. They invited the Protestant Prince William of Orange of the Netherlands to take the throne. William was married to King James II's eldest daughter, Mary Stuart. King James refused to give up his throne or to carry out reforms that William requested. However, in 1689, William of Orange and Mary were crowned the monarchs of England. William was now King of Ireland too. Most Irish people wanted to get the throne back for James II. They decided to help King James, and a war began in Ireland. Fighting broke out in Ireland and also in Scotland, where James was born. The people who fought for King James were known as Jacobites. The people who supported William were known as Williamites. King James went to France and Ireland to get support from Catholics. James was not popular with the Protestant Irish because he removed many of them from positions of power. Many Protestants did not at first wish to support Prince William, but they disliked the way James took away their power. Fighting broke out in many places in Ireland. In 1689, the city of Derry was placed under siege by the army of King James, because the soldiers there were not loyal to James and would not let his army enter the city. The siege lasted for over 900 days, causing terrible suffering to the civilians of the city. The supporters of King William eventually won and the siege ended. King James II. Patrick Sarsfield, 1st Earl of Lucan, courtesy of the History of County Dublin, 1906. Battle of Boyne, Battle of the Boyne in 1690. In June 1690, William of Orange landed in Carrickfergus. He brought a large army with him. His army was made up of Dutch, French, Irish, Scottish, and Italian soldiers and many others. William marched south towards Dublin. However, King James also had an army in Ireland at the time. Some of James's army were Irish, but others were English, Scots, and French. The French king, Louis XIV, gave soldiers to James, as he wanted James to be king of England. William's army fought King James II at the Battle of the Boyne in July 1690. The leader of James's army was Patrick Sarsfield. William of Orange won the battle and also captured the cities of Dublin and Cork. King James left Ireland for France, Battle of the Boyne. The Siege of Limerick. The Irish supporters of King James were left to continue to fight on. They fell back towards Limerick and the Shannon to try and escape William's army. At the Siege of Limerick, Patrick Sarsfield and his soldiers successfully defended the strong-walled city. Illustration of the Siege of Limerick, courtesy of Limerick City Library. The Siege of Athlone. In 1691, Louis XIV had sent to Ireland one of his most experienced generals, Marshal Saint Ruth. The general brought weapons and money with him to Ireland. In the spring of 1691, the Williamites attacked Athlone. The Irish soldiers tried to prevent William's troops from crossing the Shannon and destroyed the great bridge leading to Athlone. The Williamites built a new bridge of timber. However, this bridge was destroyed again by a few Irish soldiers. The story of this bridge is told in the poem The Ballad of Athlone. Read this poem to see if you can imagine what happened. The Williamite army had to cross the Shannon at another place north of Athlone. The war ended with the Battle of Aughrim in 1691 when the Irish were defeated. Sarsfield retreated to Limerick and a second siege began. A treaty known as the Treaty of Limerick was signed on October 3rd, 1691. Irish soldiers could join either the English or the French army. Soldiers who stayed in Ireland were allowed to keep their lands. List of casualties at the Battle of Aughrim. Catholics who supported King James were allowed to keep their property if they promised their loyalty to William and Mary. Large numbers of Irish soldiers left Ireland after the Treaty of Limerick. The people who left were later called the Wild Geese. Soon after the end of the war, new laws against Irish Catholics were introduced. These were called the Penal Laws. The Treaty Stone, Limerick. And so these were pretty dark and sinister times. Okay, I have no idea if the stream froze up or what. Ireland in the 18th century. What was the world like in the 18th century? In the 1700s, countries were ruled by kings or other powerful leaders, including emperors or sultans. In many countries, such as Russia, the poorest people were owned by the richer people. However, new ideas about the rights of people began to spread in the 18th century. Many revolutions occurred. In 1775, settlers in America went to war with the English. They wanted to set up a republic. In 1798, the people of France took power from the in 1789, the people of France took power from the king and rich nobles. Revolution in Ireland in 1798. In the 18th century, many people in Ireland were not happy with how Ireland was ruled by the King of England. By the king in the 18th century, many people in Ireland were not happy with how Ireland was ruled by the King in England. Ireland had a parliament in Dublin, but most of the time it could only pass laws that the King of England agreed with. When the American colonies broke free from England, some people hoped that Ireland would be able to come free from English rule also. People liked the ideas of liberty and equality, which they heard about during the French Revolution. In 1791, a group called the United Irishmen were set up. They wanted Irish people of all faiths to unite and create an Irish republic, which would give rights to everyone. In 1798, they tried to defeat the British by starting a rebellion. Illustration of United Irishmen in training, courtesy of National Library. American War of Independence. In North America in the 18th century, there were 13 states called colonies, which were ruled by the King of England. There was a war between America and England from 1775 until 1783, called the American War of Independence. The American settlers were known as colonists and were led by George Washington. The British troops were known as lobsterbacks or redcoats. They were not suited for war in the colonies, as they could easily be spotted as targets. America won this war and became a new country with its own government. The American rebels had been helped in the war by soldiers sent by the King of France. Then the other important one of the Enlightenment was the French Revolution. In 1789, a revolution began in France against the French king, King Louis XVI, and the rich nobles. This was known as the French Revolution. The king and queen and thousands of nobles were put to death, and a new type of government, a republic, was set up in France. The following were the last words of King Louis XVI just before he was beheaded. I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France. After the execution of the king, France did not have a monarch until the rise of Napoleon. The ideas of the French Revolution soon spread to other countries, including France. Why was there a rebellion? There were many reasons why the rebellion of 1798 started in Ireland. One reason was that there was discrimination against certain religions and certain groups who were not rich. In the 1790s, groups such as the Presbyterians and the Catholics were denied many of their rights. At the time, the richest group, called the Ascendancy, were in power in Ireland. The Ascendancy were from the ruling classes. They were Protestant and had seats in the Irish Parliament. Poorer people had no say in how the Irish Parliament worked, even though they made up most of the population. At that time, no Catholic could sit in Parliament or become a Member of Parliament, MP. Even though there was a Parliament in Dublin, most of the power was in London. The outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, with its ideals of liberty, equality, and brotherhood, caused many Irish people to consider changes which could take place in Ireland to give everybody better rights. Laws known as the Penal Laws had brought discrimination against Catholics and Presbyterians. However, these were ended in 1792 and 1793. Another reason for unrest in Ireland was due to many secret societies which developed in the countryside and sought rights for farmers and other people who worked on the land. Some of the names of these groups were the White Boys and Peep o' Day Boys. Many of these groups went out at night and damaged the property of some landlords in their area. They wanted cheaper rents and better conditions for the people who worked on the land. Clonarghadu Mass Station, a hedge school and another hedge school. United Irishmen. The United Irishmen formed in 1791. The members wanted everyone in Ireland to be treated equally. At first, the United Irishmen looked for changes in Parliament. Later, they demanded that a separate republic should be set up in Ireland. One of the leaders of the United Irishmen was a man named Wolfetone. He was a Church of Ireland lawyer from Dublin. Wolfetone was impressed by the French Revolution and looked for help from France and America to start a similar revolution in Ireland. However, in 1793, a war broke out between England and France. This meant that anybody looking for help from France was seen as a traitor by the British government. In 1793, the United Irishmen were banned by the government, and it was against the law to have anything to do with the United Irishmen. In 1794, many of the members of the United Irishmen were arrested. Wolfe Tone. Crest of the United Irishmen, courtesy of Merlin Wolfhound Press. Seal of the United Irishmen, copyright South Dublin Libraries. Theobald Wolfe-Tone. Wolfe-Tone was one of the leaders of the United Irishmen. He was born in Dublin in 1763 and became a lawyer. He was a Protestant, yet like many of the leaders of the United Irishmen, he wanted to seek rights for his Presbyterian and Catholic countrymen. In 1795, Wolfe-Tone left Ireland for America to escape arrest. He next went to France to ask for soldiers to help with a revolution in Ireland. In 1796, Wolfe-Tone sailed from France to Ireland with a French general called General Hocquet, and a fleet of 35 ships and about 15,000 soldiers. However, the ships got caught in terrible storms. Some ships sank and the sailors were lost. Many French ships waited off Bantry Bay for calmer weather, but in the end they returned to France. French landing at Bantry Bay. Wolfe-Tone's diary shows how disappointed he felt about his unsuccessful attempt to land with French troops in 1796. He wrote the following account on the 21st December 1796. There cannot be imagined a situation more provokingly tantalizing than mine at this moment. Within view, almost within reach of my native land, and uncertain whether I shall ever set foot in it, we were near enough to toss a biscuit ashore. He wrote another account on the 26th December 1796. We have now been 6 days in Bantry Bay, within 500 yards of the shore, without being able to effect a landing. All our hopes are now reduced to getting back safely to Brest. The ships had to return to France without a fight. Yeomanry and militia. The British Army heard about the ships, and they knew that the United Irishmen were planning a big fight. They decided to destroy the United Irishmen. They imprisoned many of the leaders of the movement and warned people to tell them about any United Irishmen that they knew. The government tried to stamp out rebellion. They got information from many spies and posted notices warning people to hand over any weapons they had. Houses were searched, especially the homes of blacksmiths, because they were known to make a weapon called a pike. Leaders of the rising were arrested. The government needed more soldiers in Ireland to put down any fighting. In 1796, a group of soldiers called yeomanry were set up. These were civilians who were put into groups as soldiers. There were also other soldiers who were forced to join a group called the militia. There were also paid soldiers from Germany who were known as Hessians. The army inflicted terror in the countryside. Many ordinary people were flogged and tortured to punish them for supporting a rebellion against the king, or to try to get information from them. Houses were burned and property was stolen or destroyed. Anyone suspected of being a rebel was shot. This cruel treatment by the army made many people join the fight against the government troops. Lord Edward Fitzgerald, courtesy of the National Library of Ireland. Rebellion in 1798. The rebellion began in May 1798 in Kildare. However, it soon spread to Meath, Wicklow, and Wexford. In March, 1798, 16 of the leaders of the United Irishmen were arrested in Dublin. In May 1798, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, one of the leaders, was wounded and died. Many of the other important leaders of the United Irishmen were also captured. Weapons. The main weapon of the rebels of 1798 was a long stick with a metal top called the pike. It was sharp and could cut the reins of horses. The pike was quite useful against cavalry, but it was not as good as against firearms. Piking of prisoners by rebels on Wexford Bridge, 20th June 1798, courtesy of the National Library of Ireland. The soldiers fighting against the rebels had guns. These were more powerful than the pikes used by most of the rebel forces. Many of the guns had a bayonet which could be attached. A 1798 rebel being whipped, courtesy of the National Library of Ireland. The 1798 rebellion in Wexford and Ulster. One of the main places where the rebellion of 1798 occurred was in County Wexford. The Catholic peasants were led by two local priests, Father John Murphy and Father Michael Murphy. By May 1798, the rebels had taken over the towns of Enniscarthy and Wexford. A republic was declared, but it did not last, as the rebels were soon beaten back by British forces. The Battle of New Ross. One of the bloodiest battles of the 1798 rebellion was the Battle of New Ross in June 1798, when the United Irishmen, commanded by a local Protestant landlord, Bagan O'Harvey, were defeated. Over 3,000 rebels were killed. The last battle was the Battle of Vinegar Hill in Enniscarthy. The rebels were defeated and the towns of Wexford were recaptured by British troops. Rebellion in Ulster. There was also a rebellion in Ulster. One of the leaders of the United Irishmen in Ulster was a Presbyterian, Henry Joy McCracken. He was one of the founders of the United Irishmen. He captured Antrim town, but was soon caught and hanged in Belfast. Henry Munro led the rebels in County Down, but he too was defeated and hanged. The Battle of New Ross. The end of 1798. More help came from France, but the rebels still did not win the rebellion. In August 1798, over 1,000 French soldiers landed at Killala Bay in Mayo under the command of General Humbert. At first, they defeated the English forces. However, following a lot of fighting, they later surrendered in September 1798. The French landing in Killala Bay, National Library of Ireland. Another French force arrived off Tory Island in Donegal in September 1798 with Wolfetone on board. He was arrested and died soon afterwards in prison. The rebellion of 1798 was over. Rebels who were captured were seen as traitors to England. Large numbers of rebels were given life imprisonment sentences and transported to Botany Bay in Australia. What happened as a result of the rising? The British government decided to abolish the Irish Parliament in Dublin. In 1800, the Act of Union was passed, and Ireland was then ruled from Westminster Parliament in London. The Rebellion of 1803. Rebellion and Robert Emmet. Many people in Ireland did not want a union with Britain in 1801. Some people looked for support from France for another rebellion after 1798, but they failed to get this support. In 1803, another rebellion started in Ireland. This time it was centered around Dublin, but it did not receive enough support at the time. The rebellion failed, and the leader, Robert Emmet, was executed after he was found guilty of high treason. On the 20th September 1803, Robert Emmet was taken from Kilmainham jail to a place opposite St. Catherine's Church in Thomas Street and was hanged. Portrait of Robert Emmet. Robert Emmet, South Dublin Libraries. Anna Devlin. Anne Devlin was Robert Emmet's housekeeper and from a well-known rebel family. She was put in prison for 3 years with some of her family because of her connection to Robert Emmet. She remained loyal to Robert Emmet and the other rebels of 1803 and 1798. She refused bribes of money to give information or to become a spy for the government, and did not even give in to the harsh treatment of the governor of Kilmainham jail, William Trevor. She is noted as a heroine and is buried in Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin. The village of Rathfarnham, County Dublin, has a statue erected to honor Anne Devlin. She once lived in Butterfield Avenue in Rathfarnham when she worked as Robert Emmet's housekeeper. She also delivered many secret messages for Robert Emmet and helped him to plan the rebellion of 1803. Drawing of Anne Devlin, South Dublin Libraries. Statue of Anne Devlin in Rathfarnham Village, South Dublin Libraries. Ireland in the 19th century. Ireland in the early 1800s was made up of many small farms. Most of the lands were rented to tenants by landlords. The landlords owned a large amount of land, but often they did not live on their property. Some families who had no land themselves made their living by doing smaller amounts of work as laborers. In the early 19th century, many Irish families depended almost totally on the potato to feed themselves and their families. Potatoes would grow even on poor soil, and they were very nutritious. However, sometimes the potato crop failed. Lynch's Castle, Galway in the 1800s, Cork Quays, 1800s, Cork City Libraries, Bredge in Kilkenny, early 1800s. The Great Famine, An Gorta Mór. A famine is when there is a very severe shortage or lack of food over a large number of people. During a famine, there is hunger, malnutrition, starvation, and even death among the people. Ireland had its worst famine in 1845 when a famine called the Great Famine occurred. It lasted until about 1850, but the worst years were between 1845 and 1849. It is estimated that almost 1 million people died and another million Irish people immigrated by the end of the famine. Ireland's population was over 8 million in 1841, but by 1851 it was reduced to about 6.5 million. Digging for potatoes during the Great Irish Famine, courtesy of Carlow County Library. One of the causes of the Great Irish Famine was a disease called blight, which destroyed the potato crop. The potato was the only food available to the majority of the people in Ireland at the time. The poorer people were cottiers and laborers who did not own their own land. They grew potatoes on small plots of ground and had no money to buy any other foods. The poorest groups suffered most during the famine because they had no other food to eat except the potato. When the blight destroyed the potato crops every year from 1845, the people faced starvation and death. Government reaction. What did the government do to help people during the famine? Ireland was under English rule at the time of the famine, and the Parliament was in London. When the potato blight ruined the first potato crop in 1845, Sir Robert Peel was the Prime Minister. He knew that most Irish people would have nothing to eat. In 1846, he shipped some Indian corn to Ireland and arranged for it to be sold in different parts of the country for a cheap price. This helped some families. However, the poorest people had no money to buy it. The corn was also difficult to get to some of the most remote places where the famine was worst and where the roads were bad. Another problem was that people had to cook the corn. However, they often did not know how to cook it, as they had never eaten it before. This corn was so hard it became known as Peel's brimstone. Peel's is brimstone. The Illustrated London News, April 4th, 1846. Difficult times. Robert Peel also set up relief work where people were paid to work. The government paid poor people wages to do work such as building roads or piers. However, the money they were paid was very low and the food prices were high. The wages did not allow the workers to buy much food for themselves and their families. However, it did help to feed many people, and during 1845, no one died of famine. Peel also set up relief committees in each area to collect money from wealthier people by collecting taxes. Second failure of crops in 1846. In 1846, the second crop of potatoes failed in July and August. People who had managed to survive the first crop failure of 1845 were now in terrible conditions. A new prime minister called Lord John Russell took charge of the government in England. He reduced the sale of cheap food and thought instead that giving employment was the best thing to do. Public works began again in October 1846. The government thought that this employment would help the poor to buy food. However, poor people were often too weak from lack of food to be able to work very hard, and wages were often not paid on time. In February 1847, there was huge snow drifts, and the poor had no warm clothes to work outdoors in cold and wet weather. When the father of a family became sick or died after working on the public works, the women or children in the family tried to take over the work. But it was very hard and involved carrying heavy loads or digging. This type of work was not useful in helping the people who were starving. A sketch of Edgeworth Town's poor during the Great Famine. Longford County Library. Soup kitchens and workhouses. Soup kitchens. In the summer of 1847, the government set up some soup kitchens to give the starving people hot soup. A group called the Society of Friends, or the Quakers, did a lot of work to feed the poor. They bought huge boilers in which to cook the soup. By August 1847, about 3 million people were being fed each day in total. However, in the autumn of 1847, the government shut down the soup kitchens. They expected that the next crop of potatoes might be good and told poor people that they could go to the workhouses for help. Soup depot in Cork. Views of the famine. Workhouses. Workhouses were places where the very poor, known as paupers, could go to live. Once they entered the workhouse, people had to wear a uniform and were given a very basic diet. The main food they were given was called stirabout, which was similar to a weak oatmeal porridge. Families were split up once inside. Men, women, girls, and boys were all forced to stay in different parts of the building. There were strict rules in the workhouse, such as keeping silence at certain times. Inmates were not allowed to play cards, disobey orders, or try to escape from the workhouse. People were often ill when they entered the workhouse, and this meant that many inmates died of diseases, which spread quickly in the workhouses. The main diseases were typhus, cholera, and dysentery. When did the workhouses begin in Ireland? The Irish workhouses for the poor first began when a law was passed in the Parliament in London in 1838. The law said that the workhouses should be built as places to keep the very poor people who applied for help. By August 1846, there were about 128 workhouses built. When the famine occurred, and especially by 1847, the workhouses were overcrowded and could not keep all the poor people who came looking for help. For example, a workhouse in Fermoy, County Cork, built for 800 people, actually kept 1,800 people in very bad conditions. Diseases spread very quickly in overcrowded spaces. By the end of the famine, there were 163 workhouses in Ireland. Soup depot in Cork. Views of the famine. At the gates of the workhouse, 1846. Longford workhouse image courtesy of workhouses in the UK. A Union workhouse image courtesy of Granard, its history, our heritage. Workhouse in Carrick on Shannon, present day Leitrim County Library. So, if you are wondering why exactly the Irish did have a revolution against Britain, well, needn't you try to just think for a few minutes of what imperialism cost Ireland? This is a process of colonialism. Evictions and famine immigration. Evictions. When tenants could not pay their rent, they were usually evicted. Some landlords tried their best to help their tenants and did not charge them rent. A number of these landlords went broke because of this. However, huge numbers of people were also evicted from their homes by their landlords during the famine. Famine immigration. Large numbers of Irish people immigrated to countries such as England, America, Canada, and Australia because of the famine. From 1845 to 1850, about 1.5 million people left Ireland. Eviction scenes in Crossmolina, National Library of Ireland. Battering ram, courtesy of the National Library of Ireland. The departure. Immigrant ship, 1850, Carlisle County Library. Results of the Great Famine. People have estimated that about 1 million people died during the worst famine years between 1845 and 1849. About 1 million people immigrated to America, Canada, Australia, or Britain. People continued to leave Ireland in large numbers for many years after the famine. The Irish language began to die out. Many of those who died or immigrated were from the western parts of Ireland and had spoken Irish. Some people were very angry that the English government had not done more to prevent the famine. This caused a lot of anger against Britain and lasted for a long time. A group called the Young Ireland Party, or Young Irelanders, wanted Ireland to have its own government. They began a small rebellion in 1848. However, this rising failed because it happened in the middle of the Great Famine. The effect of the famine, courtesy of Sligo County Council. Today, there are many memorials in Ireland to the people who immigrated and died during the famine. In the Dockland area of Dublin along the quay, you can see sculptures of very thin people in memory of all the immigrants who left Ireland from Dublin port during the famine years. The sculptures seem to show people walking towards the ships along the quay side. Sligo Famine Memorial, courtesy of Wikipedia. Daniel O'Connell. Daniel O'Connell was a famous Irish person who lived during the late 18th and early 19th century. He helped Catholics to win the right to become members of Parliament. He also wanted Ireland to have its own parliament. He became known as the Liberator because he looked for rights for Irish people. He arranged huge gatherings of people known as monster meetings, where thousands of people would attend to hear him speak. One of the biggest meetings ever was one at Tara, County Meath, in 1843, when about 500,000 people gathered to hear him. The government soon banned these meetings because even though Daniel was against violence, the government feared such large gatherings might lead to rebellion. Despite his efforts, Daniel O'Connell didn't succeed in getting Parliament back for Ireland. Life story. Daniel O'Connell was born outside the town of Caerphilly in County Kerry in 1775. He was the eldest of 10 children and was adopted, along with his brother, by his wealthy uncle Maurice, who lived at Derrynane House in nearby Caerdaniel. Daniel did well at school, and in 1790 his uncle sent both boys to study in France. While in France, he saw the violence of the French Revolution, and this experience gave him a hatred of mob violence for the rest of his life. After his schooling, Daniel became a famous barrister. He died in 1847 during the Great Famine. Daniel O'Connell, Dublin City Council. Ireland in the early 20th century. In 1914, a world war began. It was known at the time as the Great War, and it was later called World War I. It lasted until 1918. Britain took part in this war, and many Irishmen fought in the British Army in the trenches of France. At that time, all of Ireland was part of the United Kingdom and was ruled from the Parliament in London. There were members of Parliament from Ireland too, such as John Redmond, who was the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party. This party wanted home rule for Ireland. They wanted Ireland to have its own parliament in Dublin and to be ruled from Ireland, not from England. Home rule. Not everyone agreed with Home Rule. In Ulster, the Unionists, led by Edward Carson, were totally opposed to it. They saw Home Rule as Rome Rule, because a parliament for Ireland would have a Catholic majority. The Unionists set up an army, the Ulster Volunteers, and forced the British government to change the Home Rule Act to exclude the Ulster counties. In the south, two other armies were formed. One army, the Irish Volunteers, was set up partly to oppose the Ulster Volunteers and partly to fight for Irish independence from Britain. Another army, the Irish Citizen Army, was led by James Connolly. The Home Rule Act was passed in 1914, but it was delayed by the outbreak of World War I. The Irish Parliamentary Party asked their followers to wait until after the war for a parliament to be set up in Dublin. John Redmond asked Irish people to join the British Army. John Redmond, 1856 to 1918, image courtesy of Wikipedia. Home Rule Club site of the Fiannaglian School, Kilkenny County Library stock. Irish Volunteers image courtesy of Jem Collins. The Easter Rising. During the Great War, the militant members of the two armies in the south of Ireland began to plan a rising. They sent Roger Casement to Germany to buy arms. However, he was captured with the arms and hanged for treason. On the 24th of April, Easter Monday, 1916, about 2,000 Irish volunteers and 200 from the Irish Citizen Army occupied the General Post Office, GPO, as well as other important buildings in Dublin City. One group of rebels took over the Four Courts, and another group took over the South Dublin Union, which is now James's Hospital. They proclaimed the Irish Republic, read the proclamation, and raised the Irish flag for the first time. The British Army were taken by surprise and suffered heavy casualties. Reinforcements arrived from England. The British Army shelled the GPO and other buildings. After a week's fighting, the leaders of the rising surrendered. Many civilians died in the crossfire. The guns and fires had destroyed much of the city, and the GPO was in ruins. Roger Casement, 1864 to 1916, courtesy of the Irish Film Institute. Proclamation of the Irish Republic Defense Forces. Leaders of the 1916 Rising. At first, the Rising was very unpopular with people in Dublin and throughout the rest of Ireland. However, this opinion changed when the British executed 15 of the leaders of the Rising after a court-martial in Kelmenham Jail between the 3rd and 12th of May, 1916. The executed leaders were gradually seen as heroes. In the following pages, 7 of the leaders of the 1916 Rising are discussed: Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, Thomas Clark, Sean MacDiarmid, Joseph Mary Plunkett, Eamon Keant, and Thomas MacDonough. Sackville Street, Dublin, after the 1916 Rising. Eamon Kement. Born in Galway in 1881, Eamon Kent was a founder of the Irish Volunteers. He collected weapons in the successful Howth gun running operation of 1914. He had an interest in Irish culture, especially in Irish language and history. He was also a musician and a talented Uilleann piper. He was the commander of the 4th Battalion of Irish Volunteers during the 1916 Rising and took control of the South Dublin Union, St. James's Hospital. He was executed on the 8th of May, 1916. Eamon Kent. Eamon Kent. Kent. James Connolly, 1868 to 1916, was born in Edinburgh in 1868. He immigrated to Dublin in 1896, where he founded the Irish Socialist Republican Party. He spent time in America and then returned to Ireland to look for workers' rights with a man called James Larkin. There was a workers' strike in Dublin in 1913, and many of the workers were attacked by the police. James Connolly was one of the founders of an army set up to protect workers. It was called the Irish Citizen Army. During the Easter Rising, he was appointed Commandant General of the Dublin forces. About 150 of the rebels took over the General Post Office in Dublin, and James Connolly led that group. He was wounded in the GPO and was executed on the 12th of May, 1916. He was the last of the leaders to be executed. James Connolly, courtesy of the Irish Democrat newspaper. Joseph Mary Plunkett was born in 1887 in Dublin. He was the son of a papal count and was educated in England and Ireland. He had poor health, but despite this, he helped to establish an Irish National Theatre. Joseph Plunkett joined the Irish Volunteers in 1913 and later became a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He traveled to Germany to meet Roger Casement in 1915. During the planning of the Rising, Plunkett was appointed Director of Military Operations. With overall responsibility for military strategy, Plunkett was one of the rebels who were stationed in the GPO during the 1916 Rising. He married Grace Gifford while in Kilmainham, Gaol, and was executed on the 4th of May, 1916. Patrick Pearse, Patrick Padraig Pearse, 1879 to 1916, was born in Dublin and had a great interest in the Irish language and spent many summers in Rosemuck in Galway learning Irish. At first, he just wanted a parliament in Dublin rather than total independence from Britain. However, he later decided to start a rebellion and fight for independence. He established a school for boys, St. Inda's School, where children could learn about Irish culture and language. During the 1916 Rising, Pearse was in charge of the General Post Office, GPO. When the British Army overpowered the Irish rebels, it was Pearse who ordered their general surrender in order to save further loss of life. He was tried and executed by a firing squad in Kilmainham Jail on the 3rd of May, 1916. His younger brother Willie was also shot. In addition to being a teacher and a revolutionary, Patrick Pearse was also a poet and a writer. One of his famous poems is called The Mother. It was written the night before his execution and describes his mother's thoughts on the death of her two sons. Padraig Pearse, image courtesy of the Pearse Museum. The Mother by Padraig Pearse. I do not grudge them, Lord, I do not grudge. My two strong sons that I have seen go out, to break their strength and die, they and a few. In bloody protest for a glorious thing, they shall be spoken of among their people. The generations shall remember them and call them blessed. But I will speak their names to my own heart. In the long nights, the little names that were familiar once round my dead hearth. Lord, thou art hard on mothers. We suffer in their coming and their going. And though I grudge them not, I weary on the long sorrow, and yet I have my joy. My sons were faithful, and they fought. Cian MacDiarmid. Cian MacDiarmid was born in Leitrim in 1884, but immigrated to Glasgow in 1900, and in 1902 he moved to Belfast. He was interested in the Irish language and culture and joined a group called the Gaelic League. He joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood, IRB, in 1906, and ran the IRB newspaper Irish Freedom in 1910. Cian MacDiarmid got a disease called polio in 1912, but he was still appointed to high positions in the Irish Volunteers, and in the IRB, Cian MacDiarmid fought in the GPO during the 1916 Rising. He was executed on the 12th of May, 1916. Thomas Clarke. Thomas Clarke had been imprisoned before 1916 because of his involvement in other fights for Irish freedom. He was a member of the Fenians and was also one of the leaders of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, IRB, in 1916. He spent 15 years in penal labor, forced to do hard work as a form of punishment for his role in the bombing campaign in London between 1883 and 1898. He was a member of the Supreme Council of the IRB from 1915 and was one of the rebels who planned the 1916 Rising. He was the first signatory of the Proclamation of Independence and was with the group that occupied the GPO. He was executed on the 3rd of May, 1916, Thomas J. Clarke, by permission, 1916 Rising. Thomas MacDonough was from Tipperary and was born in 1878. He was a teacher and later taught at St. Enda School. The school he helped to found with Patrick Pearse. He was appointed Director of Training for the Irish Volunteers in 1914 and later joined the IRB, Irish Republican Brotherhood. Thomas MacDonough was appointed to the IRB Military Committee in 1916. He was commander of the 2nd Battalion of Volunteers that occupied Jacob's Biscuit Factory and surrounding houses during the 1916 Rising. He was executed on the 3rd of May, 1916. The GPO and the Rising. What happened to the GPO after the Rising? During the Easter Rising of 1916, the General Post Office, GPO, was the headquarters of the Irish Volunteers. On Easter Monday of 1916, armed groups of the Irish Volunteers and the Citizen Army, commanded by Padraig Pearse and James Connolly, took over the GPO, where they proclaimed the Irish Republic. The rebels held out for a week in the GPO before surrendering to the British forces. While the interior of the GPO was destroyed by fire because of persistent shelling, the main frontage escaped serious damage. Under the new Irish government, reconstruction of the GPO began in 1925 and the building reopened in 1929. Sackville Street, Dublin, after the 1916 Rising. Sculpture in honor of 1916 in the GPO. Nowadays, there is a bronze statue in the GPO in Dublin in honor of the soldiers involved in the 1916 Rising. It is called the Death of Cuchulainn by the Irish sculptor Oliver Shepard. According to ancient Irish legend, when Cuchulainn was wounded in battle, he tied himself to a pillar so that he could face his enemies when he died. It was only when a raven landed on his shoulder that his enemies dared to approach him. The sculpture statue, The Death of Cuchulainn, 1911-12, by Oliver Shepard, 1865 to 1941, courtesy of An Post. Saturday, the 29th of April, 1916, Patrick Pearse surrendered to the British commander, General Lowe, to save the lives of rebels and civilians. The rebels were taken as prisoners to Richmond Barracks. 15 of the leaders were executed and many others were sent to prisons, mainly in England or Wales. The 1916 Rising had failed to get independence for Ireland. However, the Rising had made the cause of independence more popular, as many Irish people were so outraged by the executions that they also began to call for independence from Britain. Outside of Dublin, the other main place where the Easter Rising took place was in Ashburn, County Meath. Dublin city centre was almost completely destroyed after the Easter Rising. There was a total of 500 people killed during the fighting. 300 of the dead were civilians who were not involved in the fighting. There were a total of 2,500 wounded, of which 2,000 were ordinary civilians. 15 executions took place after the Rising, and 1,841 suspected rebels were sent to prison in England. After the Rising, reproduced by kind permission of Lennon Hall Library Postcard Archives. So Dublin city centre was almost destroyed because of the Easter Rising. There was a total of 500 people killed during the fighting. 300 of the dead were civilians who were not involved in the fighting. So most of the people weren't even involved directly in the fight, and they were killed by what happened. Executed leaders. In addition to the 7 leaders who signed the Proclamation of Independence in 1916, there were 9 others who were executed for their part in planning or leading the Rising. In the following pages, these 9 leaders are discussed, including Roger Casement, Con Colbert, Edward Daly, Sean Houston, Thomas Kent, John McBride, Michael Mallon, Michael O'Hanrahan, and William Pierce. Okay, I'm not going to read all of that. But just of Independence. The War of Independence. In 1919, a war began against the British forces in Ireland. This war was called the War of Independence. The Irish Republican Army, IRA, wanted to force the British out of Ireland. They began to attack the Royal Irish Constabulary, RIC, the police force in Ireland, because they were seen as supporting British rule and British law. The IRA burned their barracks and captured their arms. Many members of the police force were killed and others resigned. The IRA also fought British soldiers using guerrilla tactics. This meant that they attacked the British soldiers by surprise and then escaped quickly before they could be caught. The British government sent more forces to Ireland. One group was known as the Black and Tans because of their uniforms. The Black and Tans often punished the local population, and because of this, they were feared and hated by ordinary civilians. The IRA fought against them. In 1921, a truce was called, and treaty talks took place in London to try to find a way of ending the war. Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith were among the Irish representatives at the talks. In December 1921, a treaty was signed which soon brought about a new country called the Irish Free State. It was decided that the new state would be made up of 26 instead of the 32 Irish counties. Burning of Cork. Copyright Irish Examiner. Michael Collins, 1890 to 1922. Image courtesy of Michael Collins Center, Clonakilty, and Arthur Griffith. Did I already do this? Oh, after the 1916 Rising, the First World War ended in November 1918, and a general election was called in London. Huge numbers of Irish people voted for a party called Sinn Féin and elected their members as members of Parliament, MPs. People knew that any Sinn Féin candidate who won a seat in the election would not go to the Parliament in London. They knew that they would try to set up a parliament in Ireland instead. On the 21st of February 1919, the newly elected Sinn Féin MPs called a meeting at the Mansion House in Dublin and set up a new parliament called Dáil Éireann. This was the first meeting of the Irish Dáil, and the new parliament declared that Ireland was now independent. They later chose Eamon de Valera as the first president of the Dáil. The first Dáil, courtesy of Hugh Oram. Courtesy of Hugh Oram. After the Sinn Féin MPs set up the new parliament in 1919, Ireland then had two governments. One was the new Dáil Éireann in Dublin, and the other was the British Parliament in London. Both had courts and both collected taxes, which resulted in a lot of disorder. Violence soon broke out in Ireland, and the army of Sinn Féin, the Irish Republican Army, IRA, began to attack people who supported British law. So basically, it was something akin to a civil war, an outright state of insurgency against the British Empire. But then there was another civil war between the pro-treaty and the anti-treaty. Irish Civil War. Ireland was divided into two parts with a border in between. A group called the Boundary Commission was set up to investigate whether any more of the northern counties should join the Irish Free State. 6 counties remained under the rule of England. This area became known as Northern Ireland and today is still part of the United Kingdom. Most Irish people supported the new arrangement. However, there were also many people who didn't agree with the division of Ireland into two parts. A civil war broke out between the people who were in favor of the treaty and those who were against it. In the end, the people who fought in favor of the treaty won the Civil War. In 1948, the Irish Free State broke its remaining ties with Britain and became a republic. Members of the Boundary Commission, late 1924, courtesy of the National Library of Ireland. The Irish Constitution. Bun Riachta na Héireann. The Irish people voted in the Constitution of Ireland in 1937. The Constitution is still used today. It sets out the rights of Irish citizens. It also states that Irish people have the right to govern themselves and to make their own laws. The Constitution can be changed, but only if a referendum is held and if a majority of people agree to make these changes. Constitution of Ireland, Bun Riachta na Héireann. Ireland in modern times. Ireland went through some difficult times after the end of World War II. From the 1950s, many Irish people immigrated to other countries because there was very little work in Ireland. However, the economy improved in Ireland in the late 1960s. 1950s gallery, haymaking in the 1950s. Styles, Empty Tram, Howth Summit, Fingal Photography Collection, Gaelic football match, O'Donnell Park, Letterkenny, circa 1950s, Central Library, Letterkenny. A supermarket in the 1950s, Lensman Photographic Archive. In 1961, Ireland's national television station, Radio Telefís Éireann RTE, went on air for the very first time on New Year's Eve. Before the television service began, people listened to the radio or read the paper to find out about current news. RTE had only one channel at the time. In June 1963, the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, visited the Republic of Ireland. His ancestors came from County Wexford. Huge crowds turned out to welcome him around the country. A few months later, in November 1963, John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas. In 1967, free secondary school education was introduced in the Republic of Ireland. 1960s gallery. Aerial view of traffic on O'Connell Bridge, Dublin City Library, by kind permission of Dublin City Council. Tubrit National School in 1968. Tubrit National School in 1968. Reproduced from Ardfert in Times Past by Timothy O'Connor. Snow holds up traffic, 1968. Image courtesy of Linsman. Fleetwood Snow Band, courtesy of Waterford Museum of Treasures. Denny Street, Trolley, 1960s, Kerry County Library collection. Northern Ireland. The north of Ireland from the 1960s, from the Troubles to peace. In 1921, Ireland was divided into two parts, the 26 counties in the Irish Free State and the 6 counties in Northern Ireland. In 1937, the Irish Free State was renamed Ari. In 1949, Ari became a republic. Northern Ireland continued to be part of Britain. From 1945 and 1965, thousands of new houses were built in the north of Ireland, and a good health system was introduced. People could get free dental services and free medical services. Unrest in Northern Ireland. However, not everyone was happy in the 1950s and 1960s. Due to the way in which Northern Ireland was being governed. At the time, Northern Ireland had two main groups of people living in it. The Ulster Protestants were one group, and they wanted the North to remain part of the United Kingdom. They were called Unionists because they wanted to keep the union with Britain. The other group was smaller and made up only of about a third of the population of the North. They were the Catholics. Many of the Catholics, though not all of them, wanted to break the union with Britain. Looking for civil rights. Not all the citizens of the north of Ireland found that they were treated equally. In many cases, better jobs and housing were given to people from the larger population, who were the Protestant or Loyalist group. Many Catholics wanted to be treated more fairly. In the 1960s, they began to look for better rights called civil rights. A man called John Hume was one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. However, the government tried to stop the movement from growing. In 1967, a group called the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was formed to seek equal rights for all citizens in the North. Catholic people were the main group involved in this association, and many marches were held. Some marchers, however, were banned by the government, and other marches were stopped by force. There were many disturbances, and sometimes mobs attacked the people who were marching. The 1960s. In October 1968, the Royal Ulster Constabulary RUC police officers Baton charged a civil rights demonstration in Derry. Television pictures of this event were shown around the world, and this made people interested in the situation in Northern Ireland. During the 1960s and 1970s, there were many disturbances on the streets of cities such as Belfast and Derry. There was also much violence. Mobs sometimes attacked certain areas, and families were burned out of their homes. The RUC police force found that they were not able to keep control. However, many Catholics felt that they were not doing enough to protect Catholic areas. In August 1968, the British Army was sent in to keep the fighting groups apart. It was hoped that the troops would bring order back to the north of Ireland. At first, they did bring some order, and the troops were welcomed by Catholic groups in the beginning. However, from the late 1960s, there were many murders, disturbances, and bombings in the north of Ireland. Violence during the 1970s and 1980s. During the 1970s and 1980s, a group in favor of Northern Ireland joining the Republic started bombings and tried to remove British troops and British rule in Northern Ireland. This group was called the Provisional IRA. Many people were killed or maimed in the bomb blast. Other groups, like the Ulster Defence Force, UDA, fought the IRA and the nationalist population. These groups carried out terrible shootings and killings. People were murdered just because they were from a certain religious group. These killings were called sectarian killings. Other people were murdered because they were members of the RUC police force or in the British Army, or just because they worked for the security forces. Bloody Sunday, 1972. On Sunday, the 30th of January, 1972, British troops fired on protesters in Derry, in an area called the Bogside. This day became known as Bloody Sunday. 27 civil rights marchers were shot and 13 died. Many of these victims were teenagers caught up in the civil rights rally. The army reported that they had shot at protesters who were armed. However, witnesses later gave evidence to say that those who were shot were unarmed. Bloody Sunday was an event which caused terrible suffering and sadness amongst those who lost loved ones. It also led to an increase in violence as people attacked the army and committed revenge killings. Following Bloody Sunday in 1972, the British government took power away from the Northern Ireland government and began to rule the North directly from London. This was called direct rule. 1972 Irish Independent, 31st January, Irish Independent. Derry's Bloody Sunday. The year 1972 was the worst year of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. In that year, 470 people were killed and there were almost 2,000 bombings. People began to think that war in the north of Ireland would never end. Peace agreements, Anglo-Irish Agreement. In 1985, the British and Irish governments agreed to cooperate to find some solution to the violence in the north. The Anglo-Irish Agreement was signed in 1985 by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, and the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach of the Irish Republic, Dr. Gareth Fitzgerald. For the first time, the Republic of Ireland was given some say in how Northern Ireland should be ruled. Some groups in the north, particularly the Unionists, were very unhappy with this agreement in the beginning. However, the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement did help to build peace in Ireland. In 1993, the Irish Taoiseach, Albert Reynolds, and the British Prime Minister John Major made another agreement called the Downing Street Declaration. IRA ceasefire. The IRA stopped all violence from August 1994 to February 1996. This was known as the IRA ceasefire. Loyalist groups also agreed to stop all violence. During this ceasefire, the military groups in the North began to look for other ways of settling their differences about how the north of Ireland should be ruled. Many people tried to find a solution to the problems in the north. They tried to find a way for the fighting groups to settle their differences. In November 1995, the US President Bill Clinton visited Northern Ireland to show his support for finding peace. Belfast, 5th September 1994, copyright The Irish Times. The Belfast Agreement. In 1998, a peace agreement between groups of politicians in the North was signed. It became known as the Belfast Agreement. It has also been called the Good Friday Agreement because it was agreed on Good Friday of Easter week in 1998. In the Belfast Agreement, it was agreed that the union between Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom would remain in place as long as the majority of the people in Northern Ireland wanted it. It was also agreed that the North would be governed by representatives of both the Unionist and the Nationalist sides. This is also now known as power sharing. It meant that Unionist and Nationalist politicians agreed to run in Stormont Castle in Belfast. 1998 Irish Times, 11th April Irish Times. Many people from the north and south of Ireland and from other countries helped to work towards the Belfast Agreement. Bill Clinton, the US president at the time, worked to support the peace effort, and in November 1995 he visited Northern Ireland. Important work was done by a US senator, Senator George Mitchell, who was appointed by Bill Clinton to help with the peace process. Nelson Mandela, president of South Africa at the time, also supported peace in the north of Ireland. The Irish Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, and the British Prime Minister Tony Blair were also strongly involved in the creation of the peace agreement. The Belfast Agreement of Easter 1998 has helped to keep peace in the north of Ireland. However, a terrible bombing was carried out only a few months after the Belfast Agreement was signed. The Omagh bombing. Not everybody in the north of Ireland was happy with the peace agreement in 1998. Some wanted to continue to fight and use violence to get what they wanted. One group carried out a car bombing in the town of Omagh, County Tyrone, on the 15th of August, 1998. The bombing has been blamed by a group who opposed the Belfast Agreement. This group are known as the Real Irish Republican Army. The bomb attack caused a terrible massacre in Omagh. 29 people were killed as a result of the bomb. Many of those who died were school children and young students. The youngest victim, Miura Monaghan, was only 18 months old. About 220 people were injured in the bombing of Almayafa. Many of them were seriously injured. The bombing was condemned by people in Ireland and all over the world. In 1998, President Clinton made a second visit to the north. He met many people who had lost relatives in the Almaif bomb attack or who had been injured that day. He later unveiled a plaque to honor the victims. Almaif bombing, copyright the Irish Times. The Northern Executive. The Northern Executive was established under the 1998 Northern Ireland Act to become the governing body in Northern Ireland. The Northern Executive officially took power in December 1999. The executive is made up of a First Minister, a Deputy First Minister, and 10 departmental ministers. The Northern Executive has been suspended a number of times, including a long suspension between 2002 and 2007. Joining the EU. On the 1st of January 1973, the Republic of Ireland joined the European Economic Community, now known as the European Union, EU. Membership of the EU helped Ireland to grow and develop. In the 1970s and 1980s, farmers were able to establish their own markets and set prices for their products. Roads and communication technology were also improved through funding received from the EU. 1973 Irish Press, 1st January 1973 Irish Press, Ireland in the EEC. In 2002, Ireland adopted the euro as its currency. Shops in Ireland. In the 1940s, most shops in Ireland were small family-run businesses. However, there was one large department store in Dublin called Clary's. Clary's was actually one of the world's first department stores. It was founded on O'Connell Street in 1853. It was a popular store during the 1940s and is still open today. From the 1940s onwards, some bigger shops began to open up in Ireland. The first Dunes stores shop was opened in Cork City in the 1940s. The first Dunes stores were all drapery shops. However, in the 1960s, Dunes also opened up a grocery store. Up until the 1960s, shops had only been located in towns and cities in Ireland. However, in 1966, Dunes opened the first out-of-town shopping center in Ireland. It was in Cornell's Court in Dublin. People came from many parts of the country to visit the first out-of-town superstore. From the 1960s, shops also began to get even larger. People no longer had to ask shop assistants for goods to be taken off the shelves from behind a counter. Instead, they could handle and look closer at the goods by themselves. Shopping center, courtesy of South Dublin Libraries. Advertisement for Clary's department store in the Evening Telegraph, June 1904, Dublin City Public Libraries. Shopping center, courtesy of South Dublin Libraries. Celtic Tiger years. During the 1990s, many American technology companies set up in the Republic of Ireland. Many new jobs were created as a result of these new companies. For the first time in Irish history, thousands of people came to Ireland from other countries to look for employment. Between the 1990s and the early years of the new century, Ireland became a much wealthier country. As a result of this boom in the economy, this period became known as the Celtic Tiger years. Thousands of new buildings were built all around the country. The condition of the economy began to change, however, particularly during 2007, and by 2008, Ireland was no longer booming. Many countries around the world also had difficulties and found that their workers were losing their jobs as factories and companies began to close down. This time became known as a time of global recession. New housing estate courtesy of the EPA. And how could I not mention about the Irish involvement in boxing and international sports? International sport. 1988. The Republic of Ireland football team qualified for the European Championships. 1990, the Republic of Ireland football team qualified for the World Cup for the first time. They reached the quarter-final stage. This was the first time that the Republic of Ireland team ever played in a World Cup finals tournament. 1994, the football team qualified again for the World Cup in 1994, which was held in the USA. 2000, Sonia O'Sullivan won a silver medal in the women's 5,000 meters at the Sydney Olympics. Sonia O'Sullivan, copyright of the Irish Times. 2002, the Republic of Ireland football team qualified for the 2002 World Cup. 2007, Padraig Harrington won the Golf Open Championship in 2007 and again in 2008. He also won the PGA Championship in 2008. Padraig Harrington, copyright the Irish Times. 2008. At the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, Ireland came home with 3 boxing medals from Kinney Egan, Darren Sutherland, and Paddy Barnes. Kinney Egan, Darren Sutherland, and Paddy Barnes, copyright the Irish Times. 2009, the Irish rugby team won the Grand Slam of the Six Nations Championship in 2009. Rugby Union Grand Slam Team 2009, copyright the Irish Times. And finally, I cannot end it until I get to the martyrs of the 1916, the executed leaders of the 1916 uprising. Con Colbert was a native of Limerick. Before the Easter Rising, he had been an active member of the Republican movement, joining both Fianna Éireann and the Irish Volunteers. He was the captain of F Company of the 4th Battalion and was in command of the Marybone Lane distillery when it was surrendered on the 30th of April, 1916. Colbert was executed on the 8th of May, 1916. Con Colbert. Edward Daly. Edward Daly was born in Limerick in 1891. Daly's family had a history of Republican activity. His uncle, John Daly, had taken part in the rebellion of 1867. During the Rising, Edward Daly led the 1st Battalion, which raided the Bridewell and Linen-Hall barracks, and eventually seized control of the 4 courts. He was a close friend of Thomas Clark, who was married to his sister. Edward Daly was executed on the 4th of May, 1916. Edward Daly, Limerick City Street, names of Gary Joyce, paper 27, by permission of Limerick City Council. John McBride. John McBride, John Sin McBride, was born in Mayo in 1865. He first trained as a doctor, however, he later chose to work as a chemist. He traveled to America in 1896 to further the aims of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, IRB. John McBride married the Irish nationalist Maud Gonny in 1903. He was not a member of the Irish Volunteers. However, at the beginning of the Rising, he offered to fight and was at Jacob's Biscuit Factory in Dublin when the rebels stationed at the factory surrendered on Sunday, the 30th of April, 1916. He was executed on the 5th of May, 1916. Michael Mallin was born in Dublin in 1874 and became a silk weaver. Along with Countess Markowitz, he commanded a small group of the Irish Citizen Army, of which he was the chief of staff. He took control of St. Stephen's Green and the Royal College of Surgeons during the 1916 Rising. Michael Mallin was executed on the 8th of May, 1916. Michael O. Hanrahan was born in Wexford in 1877. He joined the Irish Volunteers and was second in command to Thomas MacDonagh at Jacob's Biscuit Factory during the 1916 Rising. He was executed on the 4th of May, 1916. Roger Casement. Roger Casement was captured in Kerry before the Rising on Good Friday in 1916. He had just returned to Ireland in a German U-boat and was imprisoned at Pentonville Gaol in London, where he was tried on charges of high treason. He was hanged on the 3rd of August, 1916, and was the only leader to be executed outside of Ireland. Roger Casement, 1864 to 1916, courtesy of the Irish Film Institute. Sean Houston was born in 1891 and was responsible for the organization of Fianna Éireann in Limerick. Along with Con Colbert, Houston was involved in the education of the schoolboys at Scowell Ayana and organized drill and other exercises at the school. He was also a captain in the 1st Battalion of the Volunteers, and during the Rising, his section occupied the Mendicity Institute on the south side of the Laffey, holding out there for 2 days. He was executed on the 8th of May, 1916. Euston Railway Station in Dublin is named after him. Thomas Kent. Thomas Kent was born in 1865, following a raid by the Royal Irish Constabulary on his home in Castleleons, County Cork on the 22nd of April, 1916. Kent was arrested and his brother Richard were fatally wounded. Kent had intended traveling to Dublin to participate in the Rising. However, when the mobilization order for the Irish Volunteers was cancelled on Easter Sunday, he assumed that the Rising had been postponed, and so he remained in Cork. He was executed in Cork. Detention barracks on the 9th of May, 1916, following a court-martial. In 1966, the railway station in Cork was renamed Kent Station in his honor. And I end it with William Pierce. William Pierce was Patrick Pearse's younger brother. He was born in 1881 in Dublin. William assisted Patrick in running the school St. Inda's. Along with Patrick, he also wanted an independent Ireland. The two brothers were very close, and they fought beside each other in the GPO during the Rising. William was executed on the 4th of May, 1916. In 1966, Pearse Railway Station on Westland Row in Dublin was renamed in honor of the two brothers. All right. And that is it. That is the entire history of the Republic of Ireland. I had been waiting a long time to finally do that. So now I hope you enjoy it, and hopefully you have a better understanding of Ireland. Interdimensional Lizard says, top o' the morning. Jeem says, I love Ireland and Wales. Well, thank you. I am not from there. I am from the USA, but I would like to visit at some point. You know, just to go and see the Celtic fringe. You know, just to kind of look at, you know, listen to the music, try some of the Guinness. So I hope that when you watched this, you had at least a cup of Guinness by your side to drink, or at least anything to drink at all, because this was a long stream, quite longer compared to a lot of other stuff that I usually do. So, yeah, I didn't want to break this up into two parts, and I wanted to make sure to get this done. So, anyways, I fulfilled the promise that I made when I did Life in Ancient Celtic Times. I said that I would do a stream on all of the history of Ireland. This stream fulfills it. This is not really part of the Life and Historical Ages. This is just something that's kind of by itself. And yeah. And, you know, I hope that Drunken Surfer, learned a thing or two about how nationalism actually works. Canada is not a nation. There is no such thing as Canadian nationalism. You don't have a country and you don't have a people, Drunken Surfer. You don't have a national identity, but the people of the Republic of Ireland do. They have nationalism and they have a national identity. Toxic Angel says, hey, who do you want me to write you a diss for? Drunken Surfer, is that, if that's possible, because he's been trying to manipulate me with Euros MC to fight Mormon Shaggy for years. So yeah, I guess. All right. Let's see here. Yeah. So, Drunken Surfer, I hope that you learned a very important lesson about how real nationalism works. Okay? And on that note, I'm finished.